There were a couple of missions in Vietnam where it was just a really bad night and there were missiles coming and the missiles came up. And I said to my bombardier navigator, I said, Dick, I can't maneuver the airplane anymore. We don't have any energy left, but I'm not going to kill us. They're going to have to kill me. The Navy paid my way through college. I was the first person in my family to go to college. And then I went into the Navy and flew. And I did my job as best I could and I worked hard. Bob Mandeville, this guy that was my mentor, he said, look, if you're leaving to go to something that you really want to go to do, I'm going to be your biggest backer. But if you're just leaving this to go do something else because you don't like necessarily what you're doing right now, he said, then I'm going to sit down and talk to you about it. It triggered me in a major way in my life. I withdrew my resignation papers and stayed for another 28 years. I was a big unknown coming up to this company, this retired 4-star admiral. I called the HR director the week before and I asked her to put together a picture book. So the day I walked in, I knew all 126 people by name. And it was not a publicity stunt. It was a long way to say, hey, I care about you, and I've cared about you to learn who you are before I even came here. I had always tried to do that in squadrons and in places that I worked to get to know everybody by name. So I went in there as their CEO, and we grew the company. When you retire, no one's going to know how many stars you had. They're just going to know my grandfather was an admiral in the Navy. And it applies even now, no matter what you do, whether you're doing it here in Hawaii or in Washington, D.C., whatever it is, do something that you're excited about doing and then do your best. And I can almost guarantee you that people will recognize that and then you'll be able to move up from that.
Greater Good Radio. Connect, learn, heal, and grow. This Greater Good archive video is brought to you by Brain Gain Hawaii, a boutique executive recruiting, career development, and coaching firm. Learn more at braingainhi.com.
Welcome to our show, RJ, Zap Zlatoper.
All right. Hi, Carrie.
It's such a tongue twister to say Zap Zlatoper, but that's such an awesome name. So, you know, cats have 9 lives, and it seems like you've had a few yourselves. Could you tell us about the many things that you've been involved in for your career?
I've been through 4 careers, and I think I'm about to start on my 5th. And by that, I started out in the Navy as a Navy pilot, flew on aircraft carriers for probably 25 years, and then essentially became a senior officer in the Navy and a staff officer, if you will, an operational guy, and then served about 10 years as an admiral, and 12 of those years in Washington, so I'm a bureaucrat guy. And then after I finished my Navy career, I went back to the mainland because I couldn't find anything to allow me to stay out here at the moment. And I ran a software company, took them public, and it was a really exciting 3.5 years. And then lo and behold, I had a great opportunity to make my 4th career move, if you will, and come back out here as the trustee for the Campbell estate. And now I'm a real estate guy.
In the Navy as an admiral, what's the difference, do you think, that separates admirals from, I guess, the rest of the bunch? Everyone wants to be admiral, I would assume.
I think a lot of it, as I used to say, is luck. And by that I mean pretty much everything in life. You know, there are 2 things you can control in life, I've always said, and that's your attitude and your effort. Everything else is sort of the right place at the right time. And the admiral side, I think you can earn a captaincy, an 06 level. But when you move up to admiral, you have to sort of be lucky enough to be the guy that gets chosen because you have some certain skill. In fact, Evan, it's interesting, I was the chairman of the selection committee for one board when I was a 4-star admiral. We picked 26 new admirals, 1-stars every year. And I chaired that board, and we had 1,125 captains that we were going to consider. We could only pick 26. It was very easy to go through records and get down to that last 90. You know, they sort of stood out from everyone else on their effort and their attitude. But to go from 90 down to 26, it was really a tough cut. And when we made the announcement, I got to talk to all the new admirals when they came back to town. I said, you know, congratulations on your selection, but I'd like to tell you that if we had thrown away the 26 of you and picked number 27 through 52, I don't think the Navy ever would have noticed, and the nation wouldn't have either. So just happened to be lucky. And by luck, I mean the year that I picked people, we needed financial managers. So if you had a background in financial management, that helped you. If we needed operational people because we had something going on in Iraq, then that would help. So
it could be external. It doesn't necessarily have to be their performance.
Right, exactly right. And every year the Secretary of the Navy will write a letter to the President of the Selection Board and say, we are looking this year for people with intelligence background or people with medical background, and that's sort of a charter. And so when you get down to that close cut, you sort of look and you say, well, Kerry has an intelligence background, and Evan really he steered away from that. So I think
It's not intelligent.
So it's an interesting process that takes place, but a very fair and objective one.
Wow.
How many admirals are there at once?
In the U.S. Navy, there are about, surprisingly, some 120 different admirals, maybe 5 or 6 or 4 stars, about 15 to 20 or 3 stars, and then the remainder, maybe another 100 or so, are.
Do you still
2
think
and
it's
1 star.
luck to get from that 26 to the 4?
No, I don't think it's luck at all. I think it's skill and hard work, but I think you also have to have a modicum of being in the right place at the right time. When I say luck, I happen to have had a master's degree where I had a finance background, so it helped me because that was at a time that they were looking for finance people. And so it certainly wasn't luck in that sense, but it was fortunate that I had that background.
What are the traits that you're seeing in the 26 admirals and then the 4 admirals that make it to the next level that maybe they all share but others may not?
I think it's pretty much the same traits that you see anybody excel in business in general or any large organization. Integrity is a very big part of it. A lot of motivation to work, a lot of foresight, and just good management practices. It's interesting. This drifts a little away from the specific question, but I think it comes back to it, Evan. I sat down and kept track of the different, quote, management systems that I operated. 33 years I spent in the Navy in the different management systems. We had the 5-year defense plan, we had the planning, programming, budgeting system, we had total quality management, we had zero-based budgeting, and we had about 7 or 8 different management systems that we applied during the time that I spent in the Navy. They changed with every administration, with new secretaries of defense, and yet they all had some common units. So I came up with what I called the Zlatoper management system, and it sort of fits into all of those. And that was, I don't care whether it was Deming's 14 points for total quality management or the 7 steps of Stephen Covey's effective leaders. They all sort of fell into what I felt was a common ground, and that was 4 points. And that is, you have a goal, you make a plan, you work hard, and you take care of your people. And by taking care of people, it's not just the people that work for you, but the people that work with you and your bosses. So you keep your bosses happy, you keep your peers happy, and by that I mean not giggling happy, but satisfied that you're being a productive team member, and you take care of the men and women that work for you to make sure that they have a chance to move up and sort of stand on your shoulders and move on. So those 4 points. And I think that's the common thing that I saw in all those people that made the first step up to the 4-star. You know, it's interesting, this might drift a little from the way you started this question, but I also was the chief of personnel for the Navy. Assigned all the flag officers and all this type of thing, and I therefore, when we pick the 26 new flag officers every year, they come back to Washington, they spend a week, we call it knife and fork school, where they give them briefings on areas they might not have already heard things and how the system works at the flag officer level. And then I was the one guy that came in and gave them and everyone would preface it by saying, congratulations, you've reached the epitome of your command and your dedication to the military here, and this is your service promotion. I was the one guy that delivered them bad news. And by that I meant I came in and I said, congratulations on your selection, but I'm the chief of personnel, and I'm going to tell you that of the 26 of you, all but about 6 of you are going to retire in 5 years or less, because you're 1-star admirals, and we're only going to pick, in a year and a half, we're going to pick 40% of you, or maybe 50%, to be 2-star admirals, and from that, then we're going to pick 2 or 3 to be 3-star admirals. And so don't worry about your 2nd star, your 3rd star, your 4th star. Worry about doing the best job you can. Right now, as a 1-star, I can guarantee you'll get the best shot to be a 2-star or 3-star. And guess what? When you retire, no one's going to know how many stars you had. They're just going to know, my grandfather was an admiral in the Navy. Yeah. And so that was the thing I always felt, and it applies even now, no matter what you do, whether you're doing it here in Hawaii or in Washington, D.C. in the military. But whatever it is, do something that you're excited about doing, and then do your best. And I can almost guarantee you that people will recognize that, and then you'll be able to move up from that.
What's the best example that you've seen of your 4 management principles actually coming through and creating results?
My whole story, I ended up as a 4-star admiral, but my goal when I came into the Navy was a series of steps. My initial goal was to get into flight training and become a Navy pilot. And I managed to obtain that. It took me 2 years, and I worked very hard. And maybe as a side note on that, the Navy said, you know, if you work very hard, you get at the top of your aviation class, you'll get your choice. And I was at the top of my graduating class in aviation school, and they didn't give me my choice because there weren't any slots. I wanted to go fly F-8 fighters, and they didn't have any of those slots available that week that I came up, so they put me in a thing called an A6, which was very depressing to me because it was an ugly airplane. It was a new airplane. It was a jet that flew off of aircraft carriers. It turned out to be a marvelous airplane for me. I flew it the whole 30 years that I was in the Navy. And so it worked out well. There's almost a Celestine prophecy to this, and that fits back into it. I had a goal, and I had a plan, was to get to that next level, was work hard at school and get through flight training and take care of people. The only people I had were classmates at the time. And I became a Navy pilot. Then my next goal was to become the commanding officer of a squadron. And I worked hard at that, and I did the jobs that I had, and they sort of fed into that. And once I became the commanding officer of a squadron, I said I'd like to be an air wing commander. So I had a group of personal goals, but they never interfered with what was my real goal, which was to make the squadron that I was in the best squadron in the Navy. And then when I got to an air wing, to make that the best air wing in the Navy, so all of us benefit from that. And then when I became an admiral, I had a carrier battle group to have us all work together to be the best carrier battle group. So it wasn't a personal kind of thing. And then the promotions just sort of came along.
When you said that you set the goal to make sure that the squadron was the best squadron there, how did you make sure that the players there were also having that same goal? Because everyone has an individual goal, but you also want to make sure that they all want to be the best together.
Yeah. That's a great question, Carrie. And I think the best example, I like to think that I'm a collaborative guy, and I solicit thoughts from everybody on what the goals should be. And I think if people have a chance to contribute, even if you don't use their input, they feel that they've been a part of it and you've listened. But a good example, when I was an air wing commander, we had 9 squadrons that worked for me. And of those 9 squadrons, each had a commanding officer, and one of those commanding officers was going to be an air wing commander, and the other 8 weren't. There is a natural conflict there between those two. How to get them to work together? I sat down and said, you know, if we all work together, maybe more than one of us, you know, we can get several of us, and there'll be some other people that won't have any or something like that. But I can guarantee you, if we aren't known as the best air wing, nobody will want to have any of the squadrons have their guys move up. So I think we all work together. And the good news on that story was 3 of those 9 commanding officers got to be air wing commanders, and 2 others got subsequent bonus commands. So over half of them did well, and it was because they all worked together to make our air wing such a good organization. And that really applies, I think, pretty much on everything along those lines.
So do you just focus them in on, let's just work together, and then the end will happen how it's meant to be?
Yeah. If you're part of a great organization, your chances of moving up anywhere are so much better than being the best of a really poor organization. You know, if you're the number 2 guy at Microsoft, the chances that you're going to get a great job somewhere else are pretty good. If you're the number 1 guy at a bankrupt organization, there's not going to be a big demand for you to come in. And I think that sort of feeds it. So be part of this great organization, and I want your input for that.
You said your ultimate goal was to make your group or your squadron the best.
Yes.
But when you made your goals or those little steps to getting to a certain position, how did you know you wanted to be in that position? Is it because somebody was a mentor and they made such an impact on your life, you said, you know, that's something that I'm interested in?
Yes. I had mentors along the whole way. I always had someone that I worked for or with that I really respected, that I could sit down and talk and say, I would like to be like that person. My first commanding officer was a guy who I still stay in touch with to this day. We email almost on a daily basis. And a guy named Bob Mandeville, retired as a 2-star admiral, as a matter of fact. I was happy when he made flag because he was a great leader. He was a commander when I met him, and he brought us all along, and I sat there and watched what he did. And I also talked to him on the side. And he also gave me one of my great good lessons in the military. I was a Navy ROTC graduate. The Navy paid my way through college. I was the first person in my family to go to college. My parents were all very pleased. My dad was a hard worker that came from nothing and did wonderfully well, but no one had ever been to college. The Navy paid my way through school, so I owed them 3.5 years or 4 years of service when I graduated, and I said, well, why not add another year and fly an airplane? So I did that. And then I went into the Navy and flew. And I did my job as best I could, and I worked hard. And I decided, well, I have to pay my time back. I'm going to get a job and get out. My mother said, shouldn't you get a real job? When you're in the Navy like this, it's good to serve your country, but you have a real job. So I actually put in resignation papers to leave the Navy, and I got a job with IBM. I was going to go to work up in Poughkeepsie, New York, where passion comes into. I wasn't passionate about it, although I was a math and physics major in college, and I liked quantitative things. And IBM, and this would have been 1967, was a very exciting place to be going. But nonetheless, I wasn't passionate about it. Well, Bob Mandeville, this guy that was my mentor, pulled me aside one night, and he said, Zap, why are you leaving the Navy? I said, well, because I should go get a job. He said, look, if you're leaving to go to something that you really want to go to do, I'm going to be your biggest backer. But if you're just leaving this to go do something else because you don't like necessarily what you're doing right now, he said, then I'm going to sit down and talk to you about it. So I said, well, talk to me. And so he said, well, you do a very good job. And I said, Skipper, you're the first guy that's ever really pulled me aside and said that overtly to me. Gave me that feedback. I said, I thought I was doing pretty well, but nobody. And he said, we really want you to stay in the Navy, and I want you to, make my Navy be better. And it was that thing that triggered me in a major way in my life that's been very important to me from now on. I always try to make, and I'm sure that there's anyone that's hearing or watching this that's worked for me and said, Zap never really said that to me, but I apologize to them, but I have tried to make that a big thing, feedback on how you're doing. If you're doing well, people want to hear you're doing well. If you're not doing so well, it's even more important. I've always said it should never be a surprise when evaluation time comes around if I give you a bad evaluation. That's my fault, because we should have talked about that well before so you'd have the chance to move on. But I took that one small thing, and that fits in two ways, Evan. The small example being that for me personally, I said, okay, I'm taking this away. They like me. I'm going to stay in the Navy. I withdrew my resignation papers and stayed for another 30 years, or actually 28 years beyond.
What kind of emotions were you going through? Because, you did mention your parents said, go get a real job.
Yeah.
And, a lot of parents do guide us to what they think is right. But at the same time, like you said, there's passion. Something else that you really want to pursue, but your parents are pulling you saying, go this way. What kind of emotions were you going through, and how did you finally come to your decision of following your passion?
Well, it was interesting. It was an easy one for me in the sense that my father had started out, he had dropped out of school, high school, and gone to work in his coal mines because his dad had died, and he had brothers and sisters. And then when they got old enough to get jobs, he went back, finished high school, then went to business school, a night school, and got a job and sent money home and worked his way, became an accountant, and became a very successful executive in Cleveland, Ohio. So because of that, I wanted to be an accountant. I admired my dad. He was a hardworking guy, and he was a big part of my life. And he said, no, I don't want you to be an accountant. I said, what do you want me to be? And he said, I want you to be an engineer. So I went to an engineering college because of that. And I went because my dad, I was 16 or 17 years old, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I went there. And what I did learn was I enjoyed the education, but I didn't really want to be an engineer. And so that was my first divergence. So I had had that conversation with my father earlier. And then my mom it never entered her mind, because we had not come from a military family, that the military could be a career. She had never been focused on that. And then it was funny, my wife, when I made my first decision, I was still single when I stayed in the Navy. But by the time my second go around, when I got to about the 10-year mark, I'd married, and my mother got on my wife about, wow, isn't it time for Zap to leave the Navy and come back here to Cleveland and get a job? Like all the other people, my wife turned to her and said, Mom, Zap is doing something that he's passionate about, and he'll be a lot happier, and you'll be happier having him as your son if you let him stay in the Navy. So I had good interference from my spouse at that time for the real decision.
What drives you to do that, though? Why did you want to stay in the military?
I enjoyed the organization and the people. I'm sure that there are organizations here in Hawaii, like the police force. They're motivated to serve and protect, if you will, for the police force. The Navy, the armed forces in the United States, your purpose is to take care of all the citizens. There's no higher goal than to take care of the country. And so because of it, you tend to associate, and this was an all-volunteer force, with men and women who were motivated to that same thing. And they're very high-quality people, well-educated, a lot of personal integrity, and you get to work on a daily basis with them, and it's just rewarding to do that. On top of that, then they gave me this beautiful jet airplane that they paid for, and they let me go out and fly it. And it was something that I enjoy flying airplanes a lot, and I happen to have a skill set for it. I always used to joke I really would have liked to have been a power forward in the NBA, but I stopped growing a foot too soon, and I never got quick. So my basketball playing days are relegated to St. Anthony's on Sundays, and when we get a chance to go over here with old guys.
At what age did you realize you wanted to be a pilot, and what attracted you to that?
I started flying when I was in college. In my junior year, the Navy said, "Would you like to have some pilot lessons?" I said, "Yeah." It seemed to be an exciting thing to do. This was the early 60s. I took some private pilot lessons. I got my private pilot's license, and I liked it. And then when I went into the Navy, I said, for an extra year, I can fly in planes in the U.S. Navy. And I got into it, and it's a very exciting thing to do. If you've ever seen the Blue Angels when they come out here to Kaneohe or to Barbers Point or something like that, it's just a very exciting thing. Yeah.
You flew in combat?
Yes, I did.
So you were in dogfights and everything?
Yeah. I flew 150 missions in North Vietnam during Vietnam, and then I flew one combat mission in Iraq in Desert Storm.
Well, what's the scariest time you ever had in that type of situation? What'd you tell yourself in your mind to get through it?
There were a couple of missions in Vietnam where the plane I flew was a night all-weather attack bomber. We carried bombs to hit targets. And we were going into Hanoi one night, and it was just a really bad night where all kinds of AAA were coming up and getting shot at us, and our warnings, we had warning devices were all lit off saying there are missiles coming, and the missiles came up from the left and from the right, and you turn and you brake and you move the airplane around so that you can't. But every time you do that, you sort of slow the airplane down. So where we started at 600 miles an hour, after a couple of these we were about at 550, after a couple more at 400, at a couple more we were down to 300, and then finally we get down to about 200 knots. And just barely well, you need a certain amount of speed to keep flying. And the airplane was about to stall, and so I just rolled the wings level, and I said, to my bombardier navigator, I said, "Dick, I can't maneuver the airplane anymore. We don't have any energy left." And so I said, "But I'm not going to kill us. They're going to have to kill me." And so we just rolled the wings level, and for some strange reason, we got our speed back. And they didn't hit us. So that was the most personally frightening that I can think of, although there were several times during the day where you could see a lot more that were more frightening. However, as an interesting aside, I took part in an experiment that the Navy ran where I flew 10 missions where I was totally wired up. I had EKG things and breathing and pulse rates and all this because they were trying to do a physiological study of pilots. And on one mission where we had several missiles shot at us and several AAA anti-aircraft firings and all this thing, I got pretty excited. And when I came back and landed, we looked at all the indications, and all my numbers, my blood pressure, my breathing rate, all went up a lot when they were shooting at us. But they went up a lot more on a night carrier landing than they did anything else, and I didn't realize that. And that's what the interesting thing they discovered was that the night carrier landing is the most physically stressing thing that a pilot does.
Can you give us a little bit more in layman's terms what kind of landing that is and what happens?
A night carrier landing, an aircraft carrier, of course, is 1,000 feet long, but they have only 250 feet of it that you're supposed to land in, 4 wires across, and you come down, and of course people have joked that it looks like a postage stamp in the middle of the ocean, which it does. And you practice a lot on the ground before you go out and do it the first time. And then you practice a lot on the ground at night before you go out and do it at night the first time. But essentially they have a little lit up area, and they control you, and you just keep your airplane on a reference that has a little, what we call the meatball, a light source, and you keep that lined up so that you know you're not high or low, and then you keep yourself on the middle, and you just crash into the back of the carrier. And if you do it right, you'll catch one of the 3 or 4 wires.
That's your goal.
And that's an immediate goal. You have a plan. I want to be smooth and control. My goal is to catch a wire
No
and
second
work
chances,
real
really.
hard. And breathe a lot more, and your blood pressure goes up a lot more than I had thought.
We had this conversation earlier on the Top Gun school, and some said it existed, some said it didn't, but you actually participated in that.
Yes, Top Gun was a school at Miramar, Naval Air Station Miramar, which is now a Marine Corps Air Station as we've gone through the consolidation. But the Navy discovered after Vietnam that we weren't shooting down as many airplanes as an exchange rate has cost. How many enemy airplanes did we shoot down? If you look back to World War II, we had very high exchange rates. Our pilots would maybe 6 enemy fighters shot down for every one we lost, 10 in some cases. Those numbers had shrunk. So they took a look and they said, we need to get back that edge, so they created Top Gun. And that was, they would take 2 of the best pilots out of each squadron, each fighter squadron, put them into Top Gun. They would go through that school. They would get 6 weeks of training on how to do dogfights and other kinds of things. A lot, it was a little glamorized in the movie, but basically the same kind of thing. And then those 2 pilots' job was to go back to their squadron and teach the other 12 pilots what they had learned. And they sort of a viral marketing program, if you will.
Were you Top Gun?
Well, that's just.
Were you Maverick?
You got. I was going to say anybody that went through the school got to say they were a Top Gun graduate.
Oh, okay.
And so there wasn't. Now they would. I guess they would pick a guy that was the Top Gun. I don't know if that was true or not, but you got a patch that said Top Gun grad, and your job was then you'd go back, and your job was then to train. Now I went through when I was becoming an Air Wing commander because I was going to be in command of a couple of fighter squadrons. So I wasn't one of the young lieutenants, and they were very, very good.
Now that you're looking back, that was a number of years back, and then you can connect the dots and where it took you to your life today.
Yes.
What is the most important thing you took out of that experience that you're using today?
Out of my aviation side, I think a need for precision, being always right, because not always right in your decisions, but being precise in what you do and gathering up all the facts that you can. And then execution. That's got into the business world right now. Execution has taken on a lot of, it's almost, in my sense, surpassed the ability to think strategically. You can have the most wonderful plan in the world, unless you can execute, you can't get there. Right. And I think that's the thing I brought back with me, the precision that you need to fly an airplane, to do it right, and the need to trust your coworkers. When you fly an airplane off, a jet airplane off an aircraft carrier, there's a plane captain, a young 17 to 19-year-old man or woman who pre-flights that airplane to make sure that the oil is at the right level, that the engines are clear of foreign object damage, that it's ready to go fly. And the hydraulic systems are serviced correctly and all this type of thing. When you come to that airplane, that person says, "Good morning, Captain Zap. Here's your airplane." You say, "Thank you very much. Is it ready to fly?" And sure is. You trust that person has done their job correctly. If they did not oil the airplane and there's no oil, those engines will seize up 2 minutes out and you're in big trouble, kind of thing. So you go and you start it up, and then you go onto this catapult, which I think, Evan, you might have. Did you get a catapult ride on your chance to go out to your?
We got catapulted.
Okay. There are half a dozen young men and women there that have gauges below the ship, things that they have to do. And I always joke, these are young 18-year-olds who a year ago you wouldn't have trusted with the keys to your car, that now you're going to put your life in their hands. And they know it. And they have to do everything right, so your catapult shot has the right steam pressure so it doesn't throw you into the water because it's not enough, or pull the wheels off because it's too much. And then you go fly, and when you come back, it's the same thing, that all those people have done their job. So what it says is, I'm going to go fly this airplane, but there were, in my squadron, there were 190 other men and women who had to have done their job right, or I was going to die, and perhaps kill other people with it in the process of it. So that's the other thing I picked from that, is you got to train your people, and then you have to trust your people.
So what is the most meaningful experience that you had in the military? You have to pick the top.
I think the most meaningful one was when we had what I call the Western Pacific Naval Symposium out here. And that was, you rise to where it was. I think we're becoming a globalized world. And in fact, that's one of the reasons that Hawaii is so important. We are the hub for the United States to all of the Southeast Asia region and Northeast Asia region. We formed the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, where we brought in the chiefs of all the navies around from Vietnam to Thailand to Singapore to Australia, and I think they just had their 15th or 16th annual meeting here, and it got us talking. We brought the Chinese in, and I think talking back and forth right now, in retrospect, that's probably a very important thing as we globalize.
Is that because just in terms of the larger scope, or it taught you how to develop relationships?
I'm just thinking of the long-standing kinds of things that I was involved in, what potentially has got the longest ramifications. One of the things I felt very good about was I was a battle group commander in Desert Storm, and we had a carrier, the USS Ranger, and about 8 other ships, about 8,000 people. And I remember launching the first strike the first night of Desert Storm, when theoretically Saddam Hussein at that time and he had the world's best anti-air defense system, and I didn't know whether we were going to lose half of our airplanes or 10% or something like that. And I remember walking around all the ready rooms and telling them, guys, I've been responsible for training you for 6 months, and have I done a good job? Or, you know, I hope so, because you're going to go out and do it, and I'm just going to sit back here now and watch you. And they all came back the first night. That was a great feeling and a great accomplishment. But as far as changing the world, then I leap forward to the relationships kinds of thing.
So after you retired from the Navy, you said you didn't come across a job that you were satisfied, at least a job offer in Hawaii. So you couldn't stay in Hawaii, and you went to California.
Yeah, and well, I actually moved back to our house in Washington, D.C.
Okay. And then you started working with Sanchez Computer Associates?
Yes, up
So
in the Philadelphia area.
Could you tell us a little bit about that and how you started getting involved in the technology side?
I left Hawaii end of '96. And Carrie, as we've talked, I would have liked to have stayed out here, because I think that as far as touching the rest of the world, this is a wonderful place to be. But the opportunities at that time were not that great. So I went back, we moved back, we had kept a home near Washington, D.C., we moved back in there, and then I did what every admiral ought to do, right? I talked to all the large defense contractors. And I have to say, I wanted to try something different. Nice conversations with Lockheed and Grumman and Northrop and all of those organizations, but I said I would like to try something different. I had met a man out here in Hawaii who had come out to visit, and I'd given him a tour of Pearl Harbor and talked about it. And he essentially was a venture capitalist of large means, and he had started a bunch of companies. And he called me up and he said, Zap, I have a company that's got a great product, a software company, but I think they need some overall management skills. Why don't you come up here and talk to these guys? So we went up and I talked to Mike and Frank Sanchez, who had just started the company, a couple of young guys, and 125 men and women in blue jeans and T-shirts is what it was. And they did banking software and internet software, and it was right at when the tech world was getting hot, but before it had become overheated. And so I went in there as their CEO, and we grew the company. Then we went public and grew the company from about 125. We bought a couple other companies. We had about 600 or 700 people. And I went in there and I told them, I said, I don't know a whole lot about software. I mean, I send emails and I can run my own PC, and that's the extent of it. And they said, that's not what we need. We can do the technology portion. We need the organizational structure. And probably one of the big benefits was that I was the one guy in the company, I think, that could talk to security analysts and they could understand what I was saying. Everybody would talk about Java applets and C++ and converted buses, and I would say essentially what we do is we take this product and we can process banking interactions in a quick and efficient way and then return them out and all this type of thing. So.
Well, you helped take the company from 50 million to 1 billion. What was the strategy and how were you involved in leading the company to increasing?
Well, it's very interesting. It's perhaps left over from my father's time, but he used to talk about there are a lot of very smart people around, but some of the most educated people don't have a lot of common sense. He says, remember, common sense is important. One of the things we sat down is we said we were there to make a profit. We had a product, we want to sell it for more than it costs us to make it and have a profit and grow in the process also. So I always joke in that those halcyon days when the high-tech world was going crazy and people were selling ideas for millions of dollars, we had a PE ratio. We had a price to earnings ratio because we had earnings. And our strategy was to become, as everybody does, either get dominant in our space and continue to grow, and then to become international. We thought that there would be a lot of competition, but at least we could become global. And so we opened up offices in Europe. If you remember in 1989 when the Berlin Wall had come down, that opened up all of Eastern Europe. And so we had a lot of business in Poland and Czech Republic and everyone that was on the other side of the curtain, and in a lot of business in England. And so we tied it all together. And the strategy was to become international, but to always have earnings and just to continue to grow. And that was a nice focus. And the other interesting thing was, I mentioned T-shirts and Levi's. I was the only guy that wore a tie to work every day. And I said I wore the tie because I wanted to be dressed correctly when the Malcolm Baldrige people came and gave us the quality award. And I said, but I'd make a deal. And I said, the day that our market capitalization goes over $1 billion, you can cut the tie off. And so actually I have some nice photos, and they gave me a little cannon to symbolize the day when we went over $1 billion in market cap. All the employees poured outside, they shot out the cannon, cut off my tie, and then I just left in the spare tie in the back door.
What was the hardest thing for you personally, making the transition from the military into the private sector? Maybe something that you haven't even shared because people think you're the admiral.
You know, it was interesting. The hardest transition, I guess, when I moved into that specific region was that these were very smart, intelligent young people who worked 24 hours a day at their own rate, and then when they didn't want to come into work, they didn't come in if they didn't have something to do, kind of thing. And I was used to, okay, I'm going to tell everybody to come here at such and such a time and do this. So there was a difference in expectations. Now, they were as worried about me as I was about that. I joke that, you know, I heard Colin Powell talk about the fact that his first day when he was no longer the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, he sat in the back of his car for about 15 minutes waiting for somebody to drive him somewhere. It wasn't quite my story. But the difference was not as great as I would have thought because I was mentally prepared. I was going into something totally different. I think had I been in the defense industry, it might have been a little bit of a different shock. But I was perfectly ready to make coffee with everybody else. And one of the things that I prided myself on, and this is maybe a little note for everybody, is I was a big unknown coming up to this company. This retired 4-star admiral. I mean, they had visions of a guy with gray hair and mustache and epaulets, I guess, was going to come up. So they were very concerned about me. I called the HR director the week before and asked her to put together a picture book. And I wanted everybody's picture and the name and one fact about them. So the day I walked in, I knew all 126 people by name, and it was a big help to...
You memorized it?
Yeah.
Their face and their name?
And their name.
So you didn't have a cheat sheet like somewhere like...
No. No,
Hello, John.
Even if they put their high school picture in?
now, you know, it's
some of them may have only been a little older.
That's I was going to say. But it went a long way, and it was not a publicity stunt as much as it was a long way to say, hey, I care about you, and I've cared about you and to learn who you are before I even came here. And it mattered. I had always tried to do that in squadrons and in places that I worked to get to know everybody by name. Kerry, you brought up a story, you asked me about that, to the point that when I became an Air Wing commander, I went into one of the squadrons, and when I had first arrived, and they had all switched name tags, because in the Navy, on your flight suit, you always wear your name tags, and they swapped the name tags around. And I walked up to one of the guys, and I said, you don't look like Jim Jones or whoever. And, oh, okay. And the next guy, you don't look like Kerry. And then a third guy said, I know you're not. And so then they admitted that they had swapped the name tags around to see if they could embarrass me by it. But happily, I caught it.
Do all the admirals memorize people's faces and names like that?
I don't think so. And candidly, I had to be absolutely honest. When we went to large receptions, I had an aide who I'd periodically say, hey, Lee, who is that over there? But
that's your mom, Admiral.
But that's right. But what was very interesting, I mentioned Sanchez, and what happened was we were a growing company. When I came, we were 126, and we added 15 people a month, every month. And one of the things that we always did was every new employee had to come in and say hello to the CEO, and we'd talk for a couple minutes about where you are and which. And I got a reputation as the guy that knows everybody. Zap knows everybody in this company, which was okay until we grew to be 600 to 700 people. It started to become a real, they had a company to run over here as well as names to memorize. When we bought a company of 150 people in Pittsburgh, we sent a transition team so that our cultures could merge. And the thing they told everybody said, "You're going to love our CEO. He knows everybody. He'll know all your names when he shows up." So it was an interesting anecdote, but it was something we stayed true to. You know, it's really one of the, if you know someone's name, it's probably the most important thing. When your name is Zlatoper, you always know if they misspell your name. So that's the thing I have. Is, if I'm going to write Carrie, I will spell Kari and make sure that I know that I'm spelling it correctly.
I was wondering how that did affect, the employees in regards to the CEO really caring about me, and what difference do you think it made on the performance and the company culture?
I think it made a big impact on our company for a couple of reasons. Number one, I came in and the first day I told them, I don't know 1/100th of what you all know about the product that we put out here, the banking software package. I said, I can't learn it. I got a company to run. My interests are going to be different. So you all have different skill sets than and I'm never going to be able to come and talk to you about your programming. But I'll always be here to help you with something if you need to get more resources to go do it. Also, I had a thing where management by walking around kind of thing. I walked around the spaces in some area or another every day, more or less just stick my head in and say, "Hi, how are things going?" After about 6 months, people realized that it was more than a perfunctory, "How are things going?" It was, "Well, I got a little problem here. Okay, do you have all the help that you need, or can we help up at the other end of the building here or not?" So.
Okay, so that brings up a pretty good point. You said that you knew management, you knew the higher level pieces, right? But you didn't necessarily know the software.
Yes.
In this state that in our career that we're in now, a lot of times we think, oh, we're weak in these areas. Should we work really hard in these areas, or should we just focus completely on our strengths and then find other people to fill in those weaknesses? What would your opinion be on that?
I think it's a combination, and I guess I'll use my current position at the Campbell Estate. We're a very large real estate trust. I was ecstatic to have the chance to come back here to Hawaii, and especially to Campbell Estate. It's a great organization. I've been fortunate to be associated with what I call high integrity organizations all my life. And in fact, I've turned down 2 board offerings because my due diligence sort of said I just was not comfortable with the way that the company tended to be. I want to believe that the organization I'm working with and for is as pure as a driven snow, if you will, Caesar's wife, if you will, in its integrity and its motivation. When I came out here to Campbell, I knew nothing about commercial real estate and very little about real estate in general. So I'd bought homes in my past life and taken out loans and all this. But what I did do when I thought there was a chance was I started a very intensive personal study of just real estate in general. But in a month, how much can you learn? And that was that. You can't drill down to the how do conveyances occur and how do you get zoning through the city and the state here. Mm-hmm. But you can at least know how the process works. So I did a lot of that, and actually I wrote back to the existing trustees and I said, would you mind sending me a book on just the history of what's going on and where it is? So I got at least a modicum of knowledge, and they did the same thing at Sanchez. I mean, I sat down with the programmers and I said, you have 2 days to talk to me, and your job is to talk to me about what you do, but you have to understand, you got to talk to me so I can understand what it is. So we really went through some basic things. So I spent a modicum to get an appreciation for how much they knew, and I could generally get a good feeling.
Just so you can get a general feel, and then you concentrate on the things that you concentrate on, which is probably why they brought you into Campbell Estate anyways, was for your specific set of talents as opposed to a deep background in real estate.
Yeah, well, I hope so. One of the blessings I've had, I've worked with 3 other trustees at the Campbell Estate, and I mentioned high integrity. I mean, I've never been associated with a group that you may not like what they did, but they're honorable, honest, and hardworking individuals. And by the way, I think you would like what they did also. So.
What is it like managing so much money? I mean, with the military, it was $5 billion. Then you went with the Sanchez company, and it was $50 million to $1 billion. And then now with the Campbell Estates, I mean, it's so much money. What's the pressure like?
I think after a certain level, that becomes just another metric. The Campbell Estate is worth several $1 billion in real estate. I mean, that's a number that beyond what I can meaningfully figure out would be in my checkbook or in my investment accounts or something like that. And I think you treat it as one metric of success. You want to see a percentage return. If you have $1,000, you'd like to see maybe 1,100. At 10% return would be a nice one. If you have $1 million, he's like 100,000. And so it becomes just a matter of scale. It does also require, though, that you spend a lot more attention on some things because, well, we're talking about billions of dollars here. That doesn't mean that $100 isn't as important now as it was when you were over here watching everything. So the accounting systems have to be very tight and just.
And you need to pay attention to all those zeros, right? Make sure you don't miss a zero.
That's exactly. Get the decimal point in the right position.
I think a general thread tying all of this together through our whole conversation today is being able to build relationships. That seems to be the common thread. What do relationships mean to you, and what are you concentrating on in order to build them?
Yeah, relationships really are vital. And I think even more today in our technologically linked world than ever, because everybody at the table can get data. It used to be, knowledge is power. Everyone can have access to that power right now. So how do you make a decision on who do you go with? And everyone shows up with the same data. Everyone has the same information. And what's the tiebreaker? I've worked with Evan before, and I know he's an honest guy, and he's hardworking, and he delivers, and he executes. This person's an unknown person, or I've had a bad relationship with them in the past. It's a tiebreaker. I believe even more importantly now than it has been in the past. So on relationships, if people come to the table and one is more well-versed, prepared, has a better skill set, there's no question. But given, say, about everyone's in the same boat as far as knowledge and experience goes, how do you make a choice? I think relationships are very vital. And the other thing about a relationship is, this may be the way my wife might joke, it's how I justify playing golf. But if you go out and spend 4 hours on a golf course with an individual, you can learn a lot about that person. If they get upset about a bad shot, you say, if they get upset about a small thing like golf, I wonder how they'll handle the pressure of the business deal we're doing. Or if they sort of cheat, then you say, well, if they're cheating at golf, and that's all part of the relationship thing. And if you get a good sense of that this person is an upright individual, the golf analogy aside, I think relationships are vital. And networking feeds to it and all this type of thing, but relationships also go, I've gone through a series when I was an admiral. I had 7 different flag lieutenants, aides, if you will. And I never kept them for more than a year. I said, you're going to take you 4 months to learn what we're doing, but you'll be in every meeting, and you'll be working 8 hours a day, and at the end of it, you'll at least know that the Navy is going to tell you there are 1,000 important things, and you will have learned there are really only 10. And oh, by the way, you will have made relationships with other people that will help you during the remainder of your career.
So most recently, you accepted the position of regent at Chaminade University. How did you get involved in Chaminade, and why is this important to you? It's
interesting. My wife and I were talking about passions. And I think my passion is to do well in whatever I do. That's a strange way to put it, isn't it? It's almost a process kind of thing. I don't want to do anything and do it poorly. But if you needed an area that I think matters, I would say I'm probably more passionate about education than I am of any other type of area. And the reason is I think that is the great leveler for all of humankind. Education is an investment that you never lose on. And it's the way to raise people from poverty. It's the way to sustain people who are doing well. And it's the way for us to make the tide rise for all humankind. And so Chaminade here is a very important part of our community. And I had a relationship with Marinas High School. I went to a high school that was taught by the same order that sponsors Chaminade out here. So when I had an opportunity I spoke at their graduation some 10 years ago. And I came back here 5 years later, and they asked me to join their board, and it was a natural to do because I wanted to be involved in education. I'm on the board of 2 other universities back on the mainland. I think that education is just vitally important for all of us. You spend your whole life, you're either a teacher or a student your whole life. And if you aren't, then you ought to be, because then you're just stagnating.
Were you giving back to the community when you were younger also?
I guess it was parental drive, yes. Yeah, I was a Boy Scout where the one thing I learned was always leave the campsite in a better shape than when you came to it. And that's probably one of the hip pocket things I carry with me, even to the point now that I try to spruce up any room that I leave, or more importantly, leave every organization better than you can. And a product of my education, I went to a boys' high school, but part of theirs was community service is very important. and so it got imbued in me, and I've done that. And interestingly, the squadrons in the Navy I've been involved in, I've been amazed at the volunteer work that they've all done. At Sanchez, we sponsored AIDS runs, and we're very much involved in the community there, and we had a little corporate fund set aside to help people with what their own was. And then if you move out now to the Campbell Estate, I think we have 100% participation of every employee at the Campbell Estate in some community organization. And the Campbell Foundation itself gives, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars a year to community things.
So would you say that's a prerequisite for your leadership then? They have to be engaged in the community?
Yes. I think giving back is very important, from those of us who have so much, give back and help others. I'm trying to do the same thing for my kids. I call it the stand on my shoulders, my son syndrome. We talked a little bit before about that, Evan, where if you've done well, helping your offspring to do better, they use you as a foundation to move on, and that's the same kind of thing. And it also makes you feel better too. I've never met anybody that helped somebody that didn't feel better about it after they've done it. So if you want to feel good, let the guy who's trying to cut over on H1, let him come in. He feels good, you let him in, and he'll give you a shaka, thank you, and you wave back. He feels good, you let him in happily. You feel good, you let him in, you both go away happier, and he got there 25 feet sooner than you did. I can never understand on the expressway, just those things. And that's a trite way, but right up through working through your community foundations, your churches, it just makes part of a mature and happy life, I think.
Would you say that's part of the leadership development then of the companies that you've worked with? Making sure that your leadership team is engaged in community activities so they can develop?
And I think the trite statement in the Navy is you walk on a ship and you meet the commanding officer and you can tell within 5 minutes what the ship's going to be like, because the people, they take on his or her personalities and values. So if the people at the top say community service is important, you can say it all you want, but if they see it in the leadership, it will be infectious to the people that work there.
Do you think you're a lucky person?
I know I'm lucky. I'm very fortunate. I'm very lucky. I have a great wife. I have 2 children who have stood on my shoulders. A son who's an advertising executive and has done better than I ever did before he was 30, and a daughter who's a physician in Atlanta, and a wonderful community. I mean, I'm truly blessed.
What would you say has been your greatest life accomplishment?
To be asked by people like you to come and sit and talk about what they've done. In other words, you're validating the series of goals that I've set for myself and moved on. I'd be hard-pressed to come up with one thing. I haven't done that yet. I think as soon as you accomplish the greatest goal, you probably start retiring, and it's okay to retire, but you don't go away. Bennett Cerf was probably a man before your time. There used to be a television program called What's My Line, and I remember him once saying, I'm 63 years old and I don't know what I want to do when I grow up. Well, I suddenly have discovered I'm Bennett Cerf, and that's okay. My greatest accomplishment would probably be having a family that's come through and being associated with organizations, none of whom I'm ashamed to say I've been part of. I worked for Caspar Weinberger for 2 years, and one of the things he used to say is, never do anything that you'd be embarrassed to have your mother see as a headline in the Washington Post. I think I've managed it. Cap Weinberger would be happy with what's going on so far.
You brought up your parents and being in Boy Scouts, prior. Could you share with us maybe your fondest childhood memory?
Actually, what I recall was being a paper boy. Probably started part of my business career also. The Cleveland Press, I was the afternoon paper boy, and there was a kid that shared the next route over with me, Denny Johnson, his name was, I guess. We would deliver the afternoon paper 6 days a week, and we would charge 42 cents. I got 2 cents for each one, so I'd get 12 cents per customer. My father said, it's important that you do this well. And I was always on time, and if you wanted your paper in the mailbox, you got it in the mailbox. If you wanted it inside your door, you got it inside your door. And I always collected at 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoons, so you could count on me. Denny was a little more free-spirited, and he would maybe deliver his papers a half an hour late and sort of throw them around, and some weeks he wouldn't collect, and some he would collect. But he was a good buddy of mine. Came the first Christmas, I remember, and what I discovered was when I collected on Sundays, most of my customers would give me 50 cents and say, keep the rest. And I didn't have to give them the 8 cents back. So essentially, my profit margin was going up by 60% every week just because I was predictable and executing. Denny was having a tough time just making ends meet because he would drift behind and get in arguments with the people. And then the first Christmas came around, and almost every one of my 50 customers gave me $1.50, $2. Some maybe gave me $5. I mean, like $100 for Christmas. And then he came out with 12 bucks, I think, or something like that. I remember we compared. And what it really registered with me, that, you know, people value hard work, execution, doing what they wanted done, and it really stuck with me. And it probably carried over to what I did for years after that.
What would you say has been your greatest life challenge, and how'd you overcome it?
I remember when I was a commander in the Navy, a guy came up to me and said, "Zap, you know, you're a really pretty good naval officer, and it's too bad you didn't go to the Naval Academy, because then you could maybe make admiral." Because at that time, all the flag officers had come just strictly from the Naval Academy. And I thought about that, and I said, okay, great, but I didn't think of it as a challenge, if you will. I said, well, I'm just going to go do the best I can. And I remember by the time I got to be a flag select, they were, in fact, choosing some non-Naval Academy graduates, but up through the first 12 or 15 years of my life, that was a supposed glass ceiling, if you will, for a non-Naval Academy graduate. And I didn't intentionally overcome it, other than I said, okay, well, I just can't be bothered with that. I'm just going to keep doing what I'm going to do.
In your opinion, why should people watch Greater Good TV?
They should watch it because it's going to be on in television, and television is a lot more receiver-friendly than is just radio. I told you I listened to your program on Saturday mornings at 8 o'clock on 1420, just happened, and I find them very, very informative. We talked about the importance of relationships, but there's also an importance in I told you about education. I think it's wonderful to hear stories of people who, the folks that I've listened to on your program, who are successful people, and you can pick up a little bit here or a little tidbit there and put them together to improve your own life in a very painless and enjoyable way. I mean, if it's a matter of sitting there and watching a rerun of Friends, or listening to Greater Good or watching Greater Good TV, at the end of the half an hour or hour that you put into that investment that you make, I can almost guarantee you'll feel better about yourself having said, I've learned something. One of my biggest challenges is that when I go to bed every night, I'm an old guy, I still say my prayers, thank God for letting me have the day, just like I thank him for letting me have another one when I wake up in the morning. But I also, before I do that, I try to think, how have I made myself better today? And one of my goals is I never want to go to bed without making myself better, which means sometimes I have to turn the light back on and read part of a book that I have always at my side to say, okay, I've learned something. But you know, every day when you go to bed, you want to feel that you made the world a better place, or you're a better person yourself. And I think, yeah, if you watch Greater Good TV, you better probably check that block for the day.
You know, I asked you what was your greatest life accomplishment, and I wanted to share this picture that I had found. And this was somebody's greatest life accomplishment. Do you remember that?
Oh, this was back in my earlier life as Think Back Fleet. Roy thought this was, he was our Employee of the Year. And
That's my father.
You're kidding me. That's a small world. This had to be 10, 12 years ago?
Sometime.
Okay, 1995. So it was 11 years ago.
He's very proud of it, and he was very excited to hear that we would be interviewing you. So I thought I'd share that.
This is a real surprise. I know he's done a lot more things that are a better accomplishment just talking to you, Carrie. But at least we recognize his great accomplishment. He was what? He wasn't our Employee of the Year. I remember this.
That's right. You're exactly right.
Back at the.
And he said to tell you the joke was, you're a good singer because you're one of the judges for Carol Kai's Hawaii Stars.
That's right. That? I did hear Carol Kai also at that time. That's great. This is, your dad is. What's the reason I like the Navy? Because you get a chance to spend. There are hundreds of thousands of people like that, and they're all motivated to do the right thing and for the good purposes. They're not trying to build their bank accounts. I mean, they're serving the country, and God knows we should pay them enough to live well, but they're motivated by a greater good, right?
Okay, thank you so much, Admiral, for joining us today on Greater Good TV. And thank you for joining us today on Greater Good TV.
If you resonate with Greater Good Radio, please join our community at www.greatergoodradio.com, where you can get access to exclusive content and offerings. Hope to see you soon.